They mocked his reload trick until he stopped 40 Japanese in 36 minutes and saved 190 lives. The North Atlantic on a February night in 1943 was cold enough to numb fingertips through gloves. A heavy fog covered the sea, reducing visibility to almost nothing and turning the surface into a flat, indistinct sheet broken only by slow winter swells. At 3:20 that morning, the German submarine U-402 rose to the surface to recharge its batteries. The conning tower pushed upward with a steady motion, water draining off its sides as the diesel engines began their slow startup routine. Inside the control room, the red night lights illuminated the equipment and the worn faces of crew. Oberleutnant Karl Metzler, 27 years old, moved through the narrow passageway with practiced familiarity. He had been a U-boat officer for 3 years. Before the war, he studied engineering in Munich, but like most young men of his generation, he was drawn into the conflict early. He was competent, disciplined, and known among his men for remaining steady even in stressful situations. Now he was commander of U-402, responsible for every life aboard. Karl climbed the ladder to the conning tower and stepped outside. The cold air struck him immediately, almost burning his face. He rested both hands on the railing and scanned the fog-covered horizon. Nothing was visible beyond a few meters. Thick patches of condensation dripped from the steel surfaces around him. The only sounds came from the sea, the engines, and the low rumble of the waves striking the hull. His crew had been submerged for nearly 20 hours. This surfacing window was essential to recharge the batteries and take in fresh air. He trusted the intelligence reports that said no Allied aircraft were nearby. Still, recent weeks had made him cautious. Too many submarines had disappeared without sending distress signals. Something was changing, and nobody could identify the cause. 30 miles to the south, a consolidated PBY Catalina from RAF Coastal Command moved through the same night. Its engines maintained a steady drone as it pushed against heavy winds. The aircraft, call sign Blue 9, had been in the air for 11 hours. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Jack Horner, United States Navy, 25 years old, forced himself to stay focused. His eyelids felt heavy from lack of sleep, but the mission demanded total attention. Jack was not a fighter pilot. He never flew high-speed interceptors or glamorous combat aircraft. He had trained on multi-engine planes because his instructors saw calm decision-making and steady control under pressure. Those traits made him valuable for long maritime patrols, even if they lacked excitement. Jack had grown up in Iowa, working on his family's farm, and joined the Navy after watching newsreels of the early Atlantic fighting. Convoys had been suffering catastrophic losses. The idea that a nation could starve without any battles on land unsettled him deeply. He decided to serve where he felt he could make the most difference. His task tonight was simple in description, but demanding in execution. Patrol the western approaches, search for surface submarines, and attack any that threatened Allied shipping. He and his crew were part of a new strategy using radar-equipped aircraft to cover ocean areas previously unprotected by escorts. The real challenge was endurance. In an aircraft like the Catalina, crew members fought fatigue, cold, and monotony for 15-hour missions. Inside the cabin, the radar operator monitored the ASV Mk3 set. The new version had much better range and clarity than earlier models. The operator leaned closer to the glowing green screen, noticing a small but consistent signal. Possible contact ahead, he said. 3 miles, bearing 085. The fatigue inside the aircraft disappeared instantly. Jack adjusted the throttle and rudder pedals, turning Blue 9 toward the contact. The Catalina responded slowly, but it began a gradual bank toward the indicated bearing. The rest of the crew prepared for a potential attack without speaking. They had performed the routine so many times that every movement was automatic. Jack lowered altitude carefully, trying to stay inside the fog layer where the aircraft was harder to detect. The radar blip grew stronger. The operator confirmed the target was stationary relative to the sea, which likely meant a surface submarine. Back on U-402, Karl Metzler turned his head toward a faint vibration in the distance. He could not identify it. The fog distorted sound, and the engines below produced enough noise to mask anything subtle. Still, he listened carefully. His first officer stepped onto the bridge to report the charging cycle had begun. Carl nodded and continued scanning the horizon, seeing nothing but thick white fog wrapped around the submarine like a moving wall. Another officer stepped out to check the forward deck area. Everything appeared normal. The Catalina broke through a thinner section of fog, and the surface became visible in patches. Jack reduced power further. Balloon 9 descended until its wings nearly touched the cloud layer. The waves below reflected faint moonlight, giving the crew just enough visibility to identify shapes. The radar operator called out quietly, "Visual soon." Less than 800 yards. Jack leaned forward, eyes focused. Through the break in the fog, something long and narrow emerged. A silhouette with a conning tower and deck gun. The outline was unmistakable. Jack steadied the Catalina's descent and signaled the bombardier to prepare the depth charges. Safety mechanisms were removed. Fuses were checked. The release system was armed. On the U-boat, Carl finally heard the sound clearly. It was not the ocean. It was not the engines. It was overhead. He shouted, "Alarm! Aircraft approaching." His voice cut through the fog and reached the men below. The deck crew reacted instantly. They sprinted for the hatch. The alarm bell rang throughout the submarine. Men in the control room moved switches and valves with urgency. The order to dive echoed through the compartments. But the Catalina was already directly above them. Balloon 9 dropped out of the fog with precision. Its outline appeared only for a moment as it passed over the conning tower. Jack released the depth charges in a tight diamond pattern, designed to trap the submarine regardless of whether it managed to start diving. The charges hit the water seconds after the last crewman dove into the hatch. The submarine's bow began to angle downward, but it had not gained enough depth. The explosions hit with tremendous force. Water shot upward in tall columns. Inside the submarine, equipment tore from its mountings. Men were thrown off their feet. Lights flickered, then steadied. The hull groaned loudly as pressure waves struck its sides. Carl clutched a handrail to remain standing. He shouted for damage reports, his voice competing with the noise of rushing water and machinery. Above, Jack kept the Catalina steady, gaining altitude slowly. The fog swallowed the scene again as soon as the explosions faded. He checked the gauges, confirmed the aircraft had taken no damage, and leveled off. The crew went silent. There was no celebration. They had carried out their task exactly as trained. The Atlantic had been the most dangerous place on Earth for Allied ships. For years, U-boats had operated with confidence and near-total freedom. But on nights like this, a new factor had changed the balance. The slow, long-range patrol plane with radar and patient crews was transforming the ocean into a battlefield where submarines could no longer assume they were alone or safe. Jack turned the Catalina toward the next waypoint, knowing the mission still had many hours remaining. Carl, deep inside the damaged U-boat, worked to understand what had happened and why their lookouts never saw the attacker. For the first time in the war, the hunters began to feel hunted. Jack Horner's war did not begin with dramatic combat or heroic stories. It began in a training hangar in Florida, long before he ever saw the North Atlantic. He had joined the U.S. Navy at 19, hoping to fly fighters like most young recruits. His instructors quickly noticed that he didn't seek speed. He saw control. He made fewer mistakes than others, held altitude more precisely, and reacted calmly when engines sputtered or instruments failed. Instead of pushing him toward fighter training, they placed him in multi-engine aircraft school. It was not glamorous work, but it required endurance, methodical thinking, and discipline, skills Jack consistently demonstrated. By 1942, he had completed navigation courses, emergency ditching procedures, long-range fuel management, and radar operation fundamentals. When the United States and Britain strengthened their joint anti-submarine campaign, Jack was assigned to RAF Coastal Command under a temporary attachment. He found himself flying patrols from rough, rain-beaten bases in the United Kingdom, far from the warm climate he trained in. His tasks were clear: search for submarines, shadow them if possible, and attack when necessary. The missions demanded patience more than aggression and relied on technical ability more than instinct. The conditions were harsh. Crew members spent long hours inside the cold metal skin of the Catalina. Heating was minimal, and moisture collected on every surface. The aircraft shook constantly in turbulent air, and the engines produced a steady vibration that traveled through the seats and floor. Crew fatigue was as dangerous as enemy action. Many missions lasted 15 hours or more, with no room to stretch and no comfortable place to rest. Jack adapted quickly, but the difficulty of the job never diminished. Before their deployment to the Atlantic, Jack's unit received an intelligence briefing detailing the scale of losses at sea. Photos showed the remains of merchant ships split open by torpedoes. Reports included lifeboats found empty, cargo scattered across the waves, and convoy after convoy attacked with precision by coordinated wolf packs. The losses shocked him. Convoys were not warships. They were crewed by civilian sailors carrying food, oil, ammunition, and medical supplies. Without them, Britain would collapse. Jack realized his mission was not simply to destroy submarines. It was to protect the supply chain that kept an entire nation alive. By early 1943, his crew had completed dozens of patrols. They had flown in heavy storms, in freezing winds, and through fog so dense that visibility dropped to only a few meters. They had located U-boats, but failed to intercept them in time. They had escorted convoys and watched merchant ships struggle across rough seas. They had spent entire nights circling predetermined grid areas, staring at waves and instruments until their eyes hurt. Jack's crew consisted of men with similar backgrounds. Navigator Bill Delaney was a former schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who joined the Navy after reading about convoy sinkings in the newspaper. Engine specialist Patrick O'Neill grew up working in a Chicago repair shop and knew how to keep the Catalina's engines running even when parts failed. Radar operator Leonard Masters had worked in radio communications before the war and understood the complexities of the ASV equipment better than anyone else aboard. None of them sought glory. They sought results. The Catalina they flew was not new. Blue 9 had patches of worn paint, replaced panels, and rivets that had been hammered back into place after months of exposure to salt air. Its cockpit windows were scratched, its seats were uncomfortable, and its engines required constant maintenance. But it had endurance unlike anything else in the air. While fighters could stay airborne for only a few hours, the Catalina could remain on station longer than the crews wanted to be awake. That persistence made it invaluable. Jack's main task was to locate submarines before they could approach convoys. That meant flying long patterns across wide sections of ocean, relying on radar and visual searches. When radar detected a signal, the crew tracked it, verified it, and attempted to position the aircraft for an attack. The process required patience and silence. Every decision had to be deliberate. A poorly timed descent or a miscalculated bearing could cause the submarine to dive before they could strike. Jack practiced attack runs repeatedly during training, learning how to set the proper speed, altitude, and angle of approach for depth charges. The introduction of new equipment changed everything. The ASVMK-3 radar allowed aircraft to detect submarines at greater distances, even at night or in poor weather. The Germans had no warning system capable of detecting the new radar. U-boat commanders believed darkness protected them, but that was no longer true. For the first time, aircraft could find submarines without relying on luck or daylight. Jack understood the importance of this technology more than most. He spent long hours studying radar interpretation guides and practicing target approach techniques. He knew that radar gave them an advantage, but only if used correctly. The Catalina's slow speed meant every attack had to be planned carefully. Once detected, a submarine could dive in less than a minute. That meant the aircraft needed to be in the right place at the right time, with the correct altitude already set. One evening, after a briefing about increasing German activity, Jack walked through the hangar and inspected the depth charge racks on his aircraft. The weapons were simple but effective. When dropped in a precise pattern, They could damage a submarine even if it had already begun diving. Jack checked the fuses and release mechanisms himself. He always did. He trusted his crew, but he preferred to verify every component before each mission. It was part of his routine and part of the discipline that kept him calm during night operations over endless water. His motivation grew each time he read casualty reports from convoys. The numbers were not just statistics. He had met merchant sailors at ports. He had seen their faces, heard their stories, and understood the risks they faced without any weapons to defend themselves. Protecting them became personal. The Catalina might not have been a fighter, but it carried the responsibility of shielding vulnerable ships from unseen threats. As the months passed, Jack became one of the more experienced pilots in the squadron. New crews often asked him questions about attack procedures, weather handling, and radar interpretation. He always provided clear, direct guidance. He knew what was at stake. He knew that a single mistake could cost an entire convoy its safety. When Jack boarded Blue 9 for the mission that would bring him over WW2, he was physically tired but mentally ready. The long hours, the cold, and the monotony were familiar to him. He understood why he was there, what he needed to accomplish, and what might happen if he failed. His task was unchanged from every previous patrol. Find the enemy first, strike before they could react, and keep the sea lanes open for the ships that depended on his aircraft's protection. That clarity of purpose carried him through the darkness above the Atlantic. It guided every adjustment on the controls, every decision during radar contact, and every second he spent flying inside the fog. It was the mindset that defined his role in the war, and it was exactly why his slow, unremarkable airplane had become one of the most important weapons in the battle for the Atlantic. By April 1943, the pattern of the war in the Atlantic had shifted, but the German U-boat force had not yet understood the full scale of the change. They continued to surface at night, trusting the darkness that had protected them for years. They believed Allied aircraft could not operate effectively without daylight. That belief had been true once, but the introduction of ASVMK, 3 radar, and a new piece of equipment mounted under the wing of Jack's Catalina changed everything. It was called the Lee Light, a high-intensity searchlight designed to illuminate a surfaced submarine in the final seconds of an attack. Jack and his crew had practiced using it during training runs, but actual combat conditions required precision. The radar would guide them close, the engine noise would be reduced to avoid early detection, and the Lee light would be switched on only when the aircraft was seconds away from dropping depth charges. The lights served one purpose. It exposed the submarine's exact position long enough for the Catalina to release its weapons accurately. One night in early April, Jack's crew launched from their base under thick cloud cover. The weather was poor, but that never stopped operations. Patrol aircraft were needed at all hours, especially during periods when convoys crossed zones known for intense U-boat activity. Jack had studied the intelligence reports before takeoff. Several submarines were believed to be operating in the western approaches, coordinating attacks against supply routes from the United States. His mission was to search an assigned sector, investigate radar contacts, and protect nearby shipping lanes. Inside the Catalina, everyone settled into their positions. The engines maintained a steady vibration as the aircraft climbed to altitude. Jack monitored the instruments, adjusting the throttle and mixture controls. The night air was cold, and moisture formed on the inside of the cockpit windows. Bill Delaney reviewed their navigation plan, while Leonard Masters calibrated the radar set, making small adjustments to reduce interference from weather. Hours passed with little activity. The crew rotated positions when possible, stretching cramped muscles and drinking small amounts of cold coffee. The monotony was familiar. Long stretches of silence were normal on patrol. But everyone remained alert because radar contacts could appear with no warning. At 1:47 a.m., Leonard leaned closer to the radar screen. A faint echo pulsed at irregular intervals. At first he thought it might be interference from the sea clutter, but the movement was too steady. He adjusted the gain, cleared noise, and confirmed it again. Possible contact, bearing 110, range about 4 miles, he said. Jack immediately shifted focus. Hold on to it. Tell me if the signal strengthens. Leonard watched it for nearly 30 seconds. The echo moved at a slow, consistent speed that indicated a surfaced vessel. The outline on the radar did not resemble a large ship. The crew knew what it likely was. It's real, Leonard said. Submarine, surfaced, moving slow. Jack adjusted course. He began a gradual descent, keeping the Catalina just below the cloud layer. The engines were throttled back to minimize noise. The aircraft approached at an angle the submarine lookouts were unlikely to see. Below them, Oberleutnant Ernst Weber, commander of U-126, stood on the conning tower. He was older than Metzler, in his early 30s, and had served in the U-boat service since before the war began. Tonight, he believed the sea was safe. The sky was dark, the waves calm, and no Allied ships had been sighted for days. His men were exhausted after a long patrol, and this surfaced interval allowed them to ventilate stale air and recharge batteries. Weber looked across the water, but saw nothing unusual. Jack's Catalina continued its descent. Leonard called out updated bearings and ranges in a calm, controlled voice. The aircraft passed through the last layer of cloud, and the water became visible below. The crew searched for a shape in the darkness, but there was nothing yet. Jack's hands were steady on the controls. Then, through a thin break in the fog, they saw it. A long hull, a conning tower, men standing on the bridge, a surface submarine moving at low speed. Jack whispered, visual confirmed. The crew prepared for the attack. The depth charges were armed and set for a shallow detonation. The Catalina lined up for a direct approach. The submarine lookouts still showed no reaction. They had not heard the aircraft. Jack kept the engines throttled down. The aircraft closed the distance slowly. When they were only seconds away, he gave the command, light on. The bombardier flipped the switch. The lee light activated instantly, producing a powerful beam that cut through the darkness and landed directly on the submarine. The sudden brightness was overwhelming. The crew of U-126 froze for a split second. Then shouting erupted across the deck. Weber shielded his eyes and yelled for an immediate dive. His men scrambled toward the hatch. Panic took over as several lost their footing on the wet steel. Jack held the Catalina steady. The submarine began to angle downward, but there was no time for it to escape. Release, Jack ordered. The depth charges dropped in a precise sequence, falling straight into the illuminated water beside the submarine. The charges struck the surface one after another, sinking to their preset depth. The first explosion lifted water high into the air. The second struck the submarine's hull. The third and fourth detonated around the bow, creating violent pressure waves. The conning tower disappeared beneath rising columns of water. The lee light illuminated the chaos clearly until Jack ordered it switched off. He kept the aircraft level, climbing slowly. No one spoke. They watched the illuminated water fade back into darkness. The radar showed no further movement from the submarine. Bill finally broke the silence. That's one less attacking the convoys. Jack didn't respond. He stared ahead at the clouds, thinking about the men who had been on the deck only moments earlier. There was no satisfaction, only the acknowledgement that they had done what the mission required. The Catalina climbed back into the clouds and resumed its patrol pattern. The sea below returned to darkness, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. Jack knew this was now the reality of the war. For years, the submarines had controlled the night. Now aircraft like his controlled it instead. The shift was invisible to most people. There were no headlines or dramatic images. But every successful attack meant another convoy could pass safely. Another set of supplies could reach Britain, and another step was taken toward breaking the U-boat fleet. It was the beginning of a new phase, and Jack felt it clearly. Darkness no longer belonged to the submarines. The balance had changed, and the long, slow patrol plane he flew was at the center of that transformation. As spring turned into early summer, the Germans began to understand that something had changed in the Atlantic. They couldn't identify exactly what it was at first. Reports simply stated that submarines were disappearing at night, often without sending distress signals. Commanders described sudden attacks from aircraft that were never seen or heard. Crews who managed to return to France spoke of encounters that happened so quickly they couldn't react. They believed the Allies had developed a new tactic, but none of them understood the scale of the threat. Inside the U-boats, the effect was immediate. Surfacing became increasingly dangerous. Captains reduced the time spent on the surface, limiting it to only the minimum required to recharge batteries. They began surfacing in short intervals, then diving again even if the batteries were not fully charged. The routine disrupted the normal rhythm of life on board and increased the strain on the men. Conditions inside the submarine deteriorated quickly. The air became stale within hours. Humidity rose to levels that made clothing and bedding permanently damp. Water dripped from pipes and bulkheads. Metal tools rusted faster than they could be cleaned. The smell of diesel oil, sweat, and unwashed bodies filled every compartment. Temperatures inside the boat fluctuated sharply, sometimes becoming warm and humid, other times cold and uncomfortable depending on depth and external water temperature. Fatigue grew. Some sailors slept only a few hours a day, and even those hours were interrupted by alarms, rapid dives, or loud mechanical adjustments. Food supplies were limited and often spoiled early during long patrols. Bread molded quickly. Potatoes sprouted. Meat became oily and unappetizing. Fresh air became a luxury. U-boat commanders felt pressure from all directions. High command demanded results, but the ocean no longer behaved the way it once did. Long stretches of ocean that had been safe now seemed dangerous. Many captains began to assume that aircraft were always nearby, even when none were visible. Jack Horner noticed the change from the air. When the war began, submarines often attempted to fight back. Deck guns were manned. Crews stood ready. Sometimes U-boats even tried to outrun or outmaneuver slow aircraft. But now, every time Jack located a submarine, it reacted immediately, either diving at the sound of distant engines or crash diving without even confirming what direction the aircraft was coming from. Their reactions seemed driven more by fear than by tactics. During one particular patrol, Leonard detected a weak radar contact almost 10 miles away. It was barely visible through interference, but it seemed to be moving. Jack adjusted course and began a slow descent to investigate. The submarine below must have been operating on the surface for only a few minutes, because when the Catalina was still more than a mile away, the U-boat suddenly crashed into an emergency dive. No aircraft had been visible. No lee light had been used. No approach had been made yet. The submarine simply heard something, maybe distant engine noise carried unusually far by the fog, and reacted instantly. It left a white disturbance on the water where it had been. Jack watched the wake fade in the darkness and understood the meaning. U-boat crews no longer felt in control. The ocean was still vast, but it wasn't theirs anymore. The fear inside the submarines extended beyond physical danger. It began affecting decisions. Some commanders altered their patrol routes on their own initiative, choosing safer areas even if that meant fewer opportunities to attack convoys. Others delayed, making aggressive moves, waiting for conditions they considered safe, conditions that rarely came. High command issued orders demanding more aggression, but the crews who had lived through the new threat knew those orders could mean disaster. Jack's squadron received regular intelligence briefings describing the psychological effects observed in captured U-boat crews. Prisoners spoke about sudden, blinding lights appearing during attack runs. They described hearing aircraft only when it was already too late. Some believed there must be Allied ships or stations guiding the planes. Others thought the Allies had developed new listening devices able to track submarines underwater. Rumors spread quickly among the U-boat force, increasing stress levels. On Jack's side, the daily work continued as always. Long patrols, careful navigation, and precise radar tracking remained the foundation of their mission. But the results were becoming more noticeable. Convoy sinkings in some regions began to decline. Reports showed that more submarines were breaking off attacks early or failing to find convoys at all. One evening, Jack and his crew escorted a convoy across a calm stretch of water. Multiple ships moved in tight formation, their lights darkened, their crews tense. Jack flew in large circles above them, maintaining altitude and scanning the sea below. The radar remained quiet for hours. Near midnight, they spotted a submarine periscope at the edge of their patrol sector. The U-boat never surfaced. It remained underwater the entire time, moving slowly, likely afraid to rise. Jack radioed the convoy escorts, providing the exact coordinates. Destroyers moved toward the location and drove the submarine away with depth charges. No merchant ship was harmed that night. For the convoy crews, it was a rare moment of relief. For Jack and his men, it confirmed that the pressure placed on U-boats was working. Still, Jack understood the cost. U-boat crews were not faceless enemies. They were men living in confined steel hulls under extreme stress. Many were young, frightened, and exhausted. Jack did not feel triumph when submarines fled. He felt the weight of responsibility. His success kept convoys alive, but it also pushed the U-boat crews into increasingly desperate conditions. The psychological shift was clear. The Germans had once approached the Atlantic with confidence, treating it as territory they controlled. By mid-1943, they no longer behaved like hunters. They behaved like prey. Submarines that once surfaced boldly now hesitated. Crews that once trusted the night now feared it. Each encounter made the next one even harder for them. Jack knew the war was far from over. U-boats still posed a serious threat, and many convoys continued to suffer losses. But the balance had shifted, and he could feel it each time he flew above the waves. His slow, long-range aircraft, ignored by most, rarely mentioned in reports, and almost never celebrated, was directly responsible for that shift. The change was not sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, steady, and quiet, built through long nights, patient flights, and constant pressure. Day after day, patrol after patrol, the U-boat force weakened. The men living inside those steel hulls knew it, even if they couldn't explain exactly why. And every time Jack saw a submarine dive the moment he appeared on the radar screen, he understood that the fear growing inside those boats was becoming one of the Allies' most effective weapons. By June 1943, the battle in the mid-Atlantic intensified. This region, once called the Black Pit, had been the deadliest stretch for convoys because aircraft could not reach it from land. Now, with improved fuel systems and long-range patrols, Jack Horner and his unit were finally able to cover the gap. The Germans relied heavily on coordinated wolfpack tactics in this area, hoping to overwhelm convoys before long-range aircraft or naval escorts could respond. One morning, as Jack and his crew prepared their Catalina for a routine patrol, a messenger rushed into the operations hut with urgent instructions. A convoy designated HX-239, transporting fuel, ammunition, and critical supplies from Halifax to Britain, had reported suspicious radio signals consistent with U-boat coordination. Multiple submarines appeared to be converging on its position. Jack and his crew were assigned to investigate. The mission started like many others. The Catalina lifted off the water, climbed slowly, and headed toward the convoy's projected route. The sky was overcast, and the sea below shifted in long, rolling swells. Jack adjusted throttle and mixture controls to maintain optimal fuel efficiency, important for the long flight ahead. Leonard calibrated the radar set and began sweeping their designated area. As they approached the convoy's position, radio chatter increased. Escort ships reported sonar contacts that seemed to appear and disappear quickly. It suggested coordinated movement, possibly several submarines attempting to maneuver into attack positions. Jack instructed Leonard to widen the radar sweep. The plan was to locate submarines before they reached firing range. Minutes later, a strong radar echo appeared, too large to be a single vessel. Leonard double-checked, filtered waves, and confirmed multiple signatures moving in a loose formation. "There's more than one," Leonard said. "At least 3 contacts, maybe 4. Jack replied, "Mark the bearings. We're going in." He instructed the crew to prepare for combat. The Catalina descended through a patch of thin cloud, bringing the ocean into clear view. The sea looked calm, but that calmness concealed the danger beneath. After several minutes, one submarine broke through the fog ahead. It was surfaced, moving at moderate speed, likely positioning for a torpedo attack. Jack lined up the aircraft for an approach, but before he could close the distance, the crew spotted another submarine further east, slightly angled toward the convoy. A third shape appeared behind it. Bill spoke quietly. "It's a wolf pack." Jack understood the threat immediately. If the submarines coordinated successfully, they could launch multiple torpedoes from different directions, overwhelming the convoy's defenses. The escorts could not respond quickly to several threats at once. Jack made a decision. "We go for the one furthest back. It's the best way to break their coordination." He pushed the throttle forward. The engines responded with a deeper vibration. The Catalina began its slow dive toward the rearmost submarine, an attack position that would force the others to scatter or dive. As they approached, the wolf pack realized they had been detected. The nearest U-boat increased speed and sounded the alarm. Crew members on deck scrambled for the hatch. Another submarine further ahead attempted to adjust its course, perhaps trying to disperse the formation. Jack committed to the attack run. The Catalina dropped lower, cutting through the last layer of cloud. The submarine filled the forward view. The men on its deck were shouting, pointing upward, and rushing to dive. Gunfire erupted from the submarine's anti-aircraft mount. Tracers streaked upward. One burst struck the Catalina's left wing, tearing into the metal skin. Warning lights illuminated on Jack's instrument panel. He fought to keep the aircraft stable despite the damage. Bill shouted, "We're losing fuel from the port wing." Jack didn't look away from the target. "Hold on. We deliver the attack." The distance closed rapidly. The bombardier called out altitude and angle. Jack kept the Catalina aligned. The submarine's conning tower tilted as it began to dive. The men still exposed were climbing down the hatch as fast as they could. Jack gave the order, "Release." The depth charges fell in a perfect line, entering the water with evenly spaced splashes. The Catalina passed directly over the submarine as it descended beneath the surface. Seconds later, the first explosion erupted. A massive column of water blasted upward. The second detonation followed, then a third. Each shock wave shook the Catalina, even at altitude. The sequence indicated one or more charges had detonated close to the hull. Leonard checked the radar. "Contact is gone. No movement." Jack didn't slow the aircraft. He pulled the Catalina upward so they could ascend out of the line of fire. Smoke trailed from the damaged wing. Fuel leaked into the air, creating a thin mist behind them. Bill scanned the horizon. Other subs are scattering. They're diving. Jack looked out the cockpit window and saw the ocean surface where the wolf pack had been gathering. Now there were only fading wakes and disturbed water. The coordinated attack had collapsed. The convoy radioed several minutes later. Escorts reported no further U-boat sightings. With one submarine destroyed and the others forced to dive prematurely, the wolf pack could no longer mount a synchronized attack. Jack kept the Catalina in the air, monitoring fuel levels carefully. They still had a long flight ahead to return to base, and the leak meant they needed to ration power. Patrick checked the engine temperature, listening closely for signs of trouble. Bill recalculated their fuel projections and plotted the safest route home. Despite the damage, the aircraft held together. On the return trip, the crew exchanged only brief words, each man focused on his duties. The mission had succeeded, but it had been close. A few more hits from a submarine's guns could have crippled the plane. Hours later, after a difficult approach and careful trimming of the right engine to compensate for the fuel imbalance, Jack brought the Catalina down onto the water near the base. The impact was smooth. Rescue boats quickly approached as ground crews signaled the damage on the wing. Once the Catalina was secured, Jack remained seated for a moment, staring at the instrument panel, not out of shock or exhaustion, but in recognition of what the mission meant. One aircraft, slow, vulnerable, and often overlooked, had just prevented a potentially devastating attack on a convoy carrying essential supplies. The wolf pack had been broken by the presence of a single patrol plane. Jack knew the convoy's safe passage would never make headlines. He also knew his Catalina's silhouette in the sky would never be celebrated the way fighters were. But he understood the impact of the mission clearly. In the vast Atlantic, even one prevented attack could mean thousands of lives saved on distant shores. As 1943 progressed into late summer and early autumn, the Atlantic war zone changed dramatically. Allied commanders now had more aircraft available, and long-range liberators began covering areas that had previously been beyond reach. Escort carriers added another layer of air protection. New weapons such as acoustic torpedoes and airdrop sonobuoys appeared, extending the reach of patrol planes and escorts. But even with these improvements, the Catalina crews remained at the core of the long-endurance patrol effort. Their aircraft could stay airborne for hours longer than most others, and they were deployed to fill gaps where no other planes had the flight range to operate. Jack Horner and his men found themselves flying deeper into the Atlantic than ever before. The missions were longer, the weather harsher, and the strain on the crew increased each week. One mission in particular stood out among the others. It began before dawn on a cold morning when the sky was covered in thick cloud formations. Jack and his crew were assigned to search a section of the mid-Atlantic that had recently shown unusual U-boat radio traffic. Intelligence suspected a regrouping effort, possibly an attempt by the Germans to recover from their recent losses. Jack inspected the Catalina carefully before boarding. The aircraft had undergone repairs from the last mission's damage, and mechanics assured him it was airworthy. Still, he examined the patched wings section himself, checking that the rivets were tight and the fuel line repairs were clean. His routine was deliberate. He never relied solely on others' assessments. After confirming the aircraft was ready, he climbed aboard. Blue 9 lifted off into heavy winds and gained altitude slowly. Turbulence hit them immediately. The aircraft shook as it passed through the lower cloud layers. Jack reduced speed slightly to maintain stability. Patrick monitored the engines closely, adjusting mixture and checking cylinder temperatures as the aircraft climbed higher into the cold air. The radar operator, Leonard Masters, began scanning the ocean below as soon as they reached patrol altitude. The radar screen flickered with interference from the storm system. Leonard adjusted the gain, narrowed the sweep, and focused on filtering out static caused by the weather. Jack relied heavily on Leonard's judgment during difficult conditions like these. As they pushed farther west, the turbulence intensified. The Catalina's wings flexed visibly in the strong winds. Rain struck the fuselage in heavy bursts. Visibility through the cockpit windows dropped to almost nothing. Despite the weather, Jack held course. Their orders were clear, and convoys in the region depended on aircraft coverage. Hours passed. The crew settled into the familiar rhythm of extended patrols. They switched positions when possible, stretched their legs near the central walkway, and rationed their limited hot drinks. The storm showed no sign of weakening. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the clouds in brief flashes that produced no sense of comfort. Around the 10th hour of the mission, Leonard detected something faint on the radar. It was barely visible through the interference. The echo appeared for a second, then vanished, then reappeared further ahead. Leonard kept adjusting the set, trying to isolate the contact. After several minutes, he said quietly, "Something is out there. The signal's unstable, but it's not weather." Jack took a steady breath and replied, "Hold the bearing. We'll close in slowly." He began descending the aircraft, relying on the altimeter more than on visual cues. The Catalina entered a lower layer of cloud. The vibration from the turbulence made every control adjustment more difficult. The crew strapped themselves in tightly. Bill Delaney recalculated their position and prepared to estimate drop points if an attack became possible. As they broke through the lower clouds, the ocean finally came into view. The waves were aggressive and irregular, and visibility above the water was limited by drifting fog patches. Leonard called out updated coordinates. The signal strengthened slightly. Jack adjusted course again, flying low to avoid being spotted too early. Then, for a moment, the fog thinned. The crew saw a long, dark shape on the surface of the ocean. It moved slowly, with no sign of a lookout posted on the conning tower. Jack recognized it immediately. A submarine traveling on the surface, likely unaware of the aircraft due to the storm masking engine noise. Bill whispered, "They don't hear us." Jack didn't respond. He was already lining up the approach. The Catalina lowered altitude further until the waves looked close enough to reach out and touch. The submarine continued forward at a steady pace, making no attempt to dive. Leonard confirmed the identification. Definitely a U-boat. No radar detection equipment. They don't know we're here. Jack positioned the aircraft for an attack. The bombardier prepared the depth charges, checking the safety catches. The crew worked quickly and silently. They had rehearsed these procedures countless times. As they drew closer, the submarine crew remained unaware of the danger. The conning tower hatch was closed. The deck was empty. It looked like a crew operating on minimal rest, possibly forced to surface only because their batteries were nearly depleted. Jack began to run. The aircraft vibrated heavily in the wind. The rain reduced visibility again. Bill called out distance and angle. Jack held the Catalina steady despite the storm pushing it sideways. When they reached the release point, Jack gave the order. The depth charges dropped cleanly. The Catalina pulled upward as fast as the conditions allowed. Moments later, a powerful explosion broke the surface. Then another. Water and debris shot upward, mixing with the rain. The radar confirmed a sudden loss of movement below. The submarine had not survived the initial detonations. The attack was over in seconds. Jack kept climbing until they re-entered the clouds. The storm swallowed the aircraft once again. The crew remained silent, each man processing the mission in his own way. There was no sense of victory, only the acknowledgement that the task had been completed and that the ocean was now safer for the convoys in that sector. Fuel levels were decreasing faster than expected due to the strong headwinds. Bill recalculated the return route and confirmed they would make it back, but only with careful engine management. Patrick adjusted the throttle, leaning the mixture further than usual. The engines responded with a slightly rougher note, but fuel consumption improved. The return journey lasted several more hours. The storm continued until they were near the coast. Visibility improved slowly as they approached their base. Jack guided the Catalina down toward the water and landed with a controlled impact. Ground crew rushed to secure the plane as the engines shut down. Jack sat still for a moment, his hands resting on the controls. The mission had lasted nearly 17 hours, longer than most combat operations conducted anywhere in the world. He was tired, cold, and mentally drained, but he understood the significance. Each long patrol, each radar contact, each submarine neutralized contributed to the slow collapse of the U-boat campaign. The shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't visible to the public, but Jack and his crew felt it every time they returned from a mission like this. The pressure they placed on the enemy was constant and unrelenting. And for the submariners who surfaced into storms and darkness, unsure if an aircraft was waiting above, the psychological impact was devastating. By early 1944, the German U-boat force was no longer the dominant threat it had been at the start of the war. Patrol aircraft, escort carriers, improved sonar, and coordinated air-sea operations had pushed the submarines into constant retreat. Losses among U-boat crews were severe. Many submariners were entering their patrols already expecting not to return. Allied intelligence intercepted messages revealing growing doubt among German commanders, and Jack Horner could see the evidence in the skies and seas he patrolled daily. Convoys now crossed areas that once had been extremely dangerous with noticeably fewer attacks. Instead of wolf packs coordinating large offensives, U-boats attempted isolated strikes that seldom succeeded. Many submarines were forced to remain submerged for long stretches, surfacing only when absolutely necessary. This extended submersion exhausted their batteries and limited their ability to operate. During this period, Jack's missions changed in tone. The goals remained the same: destroy U-boats and protect convoys, but the nature of the encounter shifted. Instead of confronting confident submarine crews, he found vessels that appeared hesitant, fatigued, and operating with minimal coordination. Radios were quieter. Movement patterns were irregular. Radar contacts often showed submarines diving the moment they detected even faint engine noise. On a cold morning in February, Jack's crew took off from base after receiving a report from a destroyer escorting a convoy west of Ireland. The escort had detected an unidentified contact on sonar, but lost it minutes later. Intelligence suspected a lone U-boat attempting to position itself for an attack. Jack's Catalina was assigned to locate it. The sky was clear at first, and the sea below appeared calm. Jack flew at medium altitude, maintaining a steady speed while Leonard searched the radar screen. They flew a wide pattern around the convoy's recorded location, gradually narrowing the search area. After nearly an hour, Leonard picked up a weak signal. It was inconsistent, fading in and out. He adjusted the radar's gain, filtered environmental interference, and confirmed it again. Possible contact, low surface return. Might be periscope height or a small surface target. Jack began descending. They approached the bearing slowly, staying outside possible detection range. When they dropped below the cloud cover, visibility was reduced by a layer of haze drifting over the water. Jack leveled the aircraft to maintain a stable altitude for visual search. Then Bill pointed toward a patch of calm water, breaking the pattern of the surrounding waves. There, something's surfacing. Jack focused on the area. A dark shape rose slowly through the water. It was the top of a conning tower. The submarine broke the surface completely a moment later. Its forward hatches remained shut, and no crew appeared immediately. It looked like a submarine that had been underwater far too long and was surfacing only because its air quality or battery levels had become critical. For several seconds, the submarine drifted without any visible activity. Then a single figure emerged onto the bridge, an officer, unsteady and visibly fatigued. He scanned the horizon but appeared unaware of the Catalina above. Jack positioned the aircraft for an attack approach. He instructed the bombardier to prepare the depth charges. The submarine's crew finally realized an aircraft was approaching. Several men rushed onto the deck, shouting and pointing upward. The officer on the conning tower waved frantically toward the hatch, ordering his men to dive. The submarine began to tilt forward, but Jack noticed something unusual. The submarine was not moving efficiently. Its dive angle was shallow, and its forward momentum was weak. Bill spoke quietly. They don't have battery power. They're trying, but they can't get under fast enough. Jack steadied the Catalina. At the release point, he gave the order. The depth charges fell cleanly. The submarine's bow had barely submerged when the first explosion struck. Water erupted upward. The second and third detonations followed, each shaking the surrounding sea. When the spray settled, the submarine's stern was still visible, rising unnaturally high before it slipped beneath the surface. The radar confirmed no further movement. It was over. Jack climbed the aircraft back to a safe altitude. The sea below calmed quickly, leaving only small patches of debris. No survivors appeared. The crew remained silent as they circled once more, confirming the area was clear before resuming their patrol. A few days later, another mission took Jack and his men further into the Atlantic. This time, the encounter was different. The radar detected a surfaced submarine traveling at slow speed. As the Catalina descended for visual confirmation, Jack saw something unusual on the deck. Several crew members stood with their hands raised. A white cloth was tied to the end of a pole and held high. The submarine was surrendering. Jack immediately canceled the attack run. He circled at a safe distance while Bill contacted Naval Command to report the situation. Destroyers were dispatched to intercept the submarine. Jack and his crew remained overhead until they arrived. As the escort ships approached, the U-boat crew remained on deck with their hands raised. Some appeared exhausted. Others looked too weak to stand upright. When the destroyers reached them, the German crew complied without resistance. They climbed onto the rescue boats slowly, many showing signs of dehydration and oxygen deprivation. Jack watched the entire scene from above. It was the first time he had witnessed a submarine surrender at sea. He didn't speak for several minutes. No one in the aircraft did. Their role in the war had evolved into more than attacking. It had become a pressure that forced submariners into choices they would never have considered earlier in the conflict. The men surrendering below him were not defeated by a single attack. They were defeated by months of constant fear, lack of rest, low supplies, and an enemy that could appear at any hour from above. Jack understood that the battle for the Atlantic was entering its final phase. The U-boat fleet was no longer capable of major offensive operations. The submarines that did venture out were fewer, operated under extreme caution, and often returned to port without engaging. The war was not over, but its direction was clear. Air power, long range, persistent, and often overlooked, had transformed the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a dangerous place for submarines to operate. Jack finished his patrol, returned to base, and completed his mission report with the same calm tone he always used. But he knew the significance of what he had witnessed. The surrender he saw that day marked something deeper than a single submarine giving up. It represented the collapse of the confidence that had once defined the U-boat force. The hunters, once feared across the Atlantic, were now operating in conditions that made even survival uncertain. Jack had not joined the war seeking glory. His aircraft was slow, old, and rarely mentioned in reports. But through long missions, relentless patrols, and constant pressure, he and others like him had changed the course of the conflict. They had made the ocean safer, convoy by convoy, patrol by patrol. And though his plane carried no prestige, Jack understood its impact. The U-boats had lost control of the night. They had lost control of the sea. They had lost the ability to terrify the convoys they once preyed upon. The shift was complete. The hunters had become the hunted.